del ardiente sol, bajo su cielo azul, adorable trigueña de todas las flores, la reina eres tú. En Cuba, la isla hermosa del ardiente sol, bajo su...
As a first-generation American conductor with heritage from Spain, I have focused my research on Iberian choral genres formed as a result of Spaniards traveling to the New World due to either forced or self-decided means. During the colonial period, the travels of my Spanish migrant ancestors to the New World were often forced by a need to find sustenance for their families due to unsatisfactory conditions in their homeland. Other times, they traveled by choice in seeking adventure in the newly discovered exotic lands. Regardless of which, they did not readily see the impact their back-and-forth journeys would have in forming new musical genres. The focus of this presentation is the habanera, which is a music and dance form that originated in Havana, Cuba during the 18th century colonial period of the island. The Spanish migrants returned to Spain with the sensual habanera rhythm and experiences on the island and fused these with Iberian romanticism. The habanera caused an immediate impact when it arrived in Europe. Prominent composers such as Bizet, Debussy, Ravel, Gottschalk, and Chabrier featured the exotic style in their works. Over the evolutionary course of a century after its arrival in Spain, habaneras were composed and arranged in a variety of unaccompanied choral transcriptions to produce a new Spanish choral art form known as the Polyphonic choral habanera. This valuable form has remained relatively unfamiliar to non-Iberian choral circles. In this presentation, I will discuss the roots of the habanera rhythm and musical style by first discussing early Cuban colonial history. I will then trace the connections between Spain and Cuba, which brought the form to Europe. The discussion will detail the influences of the habanera on broader European styles, which will lead to an explanation of its manifestation in a 20th century genre known as the Polyphonic choral habanera. My efforts will ultimately allow me to serve as a bridge between Spain and the rest of the world in outlining the origin and evolution of the Polyphonic choral habanera in order to unlock a valuable body of relatively unknown choral repertoire for ensembles and audiences. Very little has been written on the habanera genre. Looking at books touching on the habanera, we can find a few written primarily by Cuban music historians of the mid-20th century, looking to document the importance of this national musical contribution. Additionally, any discussion of the polyphonic choral habanera is completely scant, with few references to it in a handful of books. With further research, it was discovered that not a single Spanish historian had devoted any effort to the form. This is due to the choral genre slowly emerging from popular music circles, to now having the opportunity to be a valuable enough contribution to insert itself into Spanish art music. Regarding dissertations on the habanera, there is a dissertation focusing on how the habanera shaped the city of Torrevieja, which features an annual choral contest in July, attracting tourists and prepared choral ensembles competing in showcasing choral habaneras. The dissertation, prepared in 2013 at the Universidad Miguel Hernández de Elche by Manuel Cañizares Llanes, titled La Habanera en Torrevieja, Patrimonio Cultural Imaginado, is not written by a musician and therefore takes no musical stance. Instead, the information is purely anthropological and at times sociological, which does provide an excellent amount of information for me to utilize in formulating a strong discussion that will be geared towards the music. I was quite excited to discover the possibility of a complete dissertation devoted to the polyphonic choral habanera prepared by José Fernández Sánchez. This information was gathered at the announcement in Objetivo Torrevieja, a cultural society propelling the valuable events of the city of Torrevieja. The conference was held in announcing the dissertation of the work of the author on December 10th, 2010, in Torrevieja. The document in discussion was titled La Habanera, Evolución Social, Musical y Pedagógica en Torrevieja, meaning the Habanera, social, musical, and pedagogical evolution in Torrevieja. At the time, Mr. Sanchez was preparing the document at the Universidad de Murcia in Spain for his doctoral completion there. It was recounted that the conference included a discussion, photos of choruses of Torrevieja, and reference to important Habanera composers. It was recorded that the audience was very grateful for the presentation on the vast undertaking offering to showcase the polyphonic choral Habanera, which is conserved as a treasure of Torrevieja. It was pronounced that the dissertation would be a complete undertaking in 2 volumes, totaling almost 800 pages, with a purpose in showcasing that the Habanera would be suitable and appropriate for presentation and use in music conservatories and universities. Upon hearing this exciting news, I immediately sought to request a copy of the dissertation from the University of Murcia. Upon requesting an international library loan from the University of Oklahoma, I was contacted soon after by the University of Murcia, explaining that no such document was completed. They did explain that there was an intention to complete it, but it never came to be. They apologized and stated that they would remove the item identification number from their catalog. I found this quite concerning and reached out directly to Mr. Sanchez, who responded. He initially avoided the discussion concerning the dissertation, but eventually abruptly stated that ultimately it was never completed and never published. No further discussion concerning the dissertation or topic was able to be had with Mr. Sanchez. Regarding Habanera scores available, very few publishing houses have undertaken the journey of offering polyphonic choral Habaneras in print. This task was thankfully remedied by the organizers of the organization running the Certamen Internacional de Habaneras y Polifonía, meaning the International Contest of Habaneras and Polyphony. The organization valuably commissions works in the Habanera style to be featured as required selections each year at their contest. Each year requires one such work in common to be learned by the competing choirs. The commission also offers an edition of new repertoire composed each year, which has added to the growth of the polyphonic choral Habanera repertoire since the contest's inception in 1954. Furthermore, the organization also harbors all known polyphonic choral Habaneras at an open-source website geared at promoting the music. It is a valuable resource for all choirs interested in incorporating this repertoire. The need for a discussion on the early history of Cuba is of paramount importance in this presentation, due to certain events transpiring early in Cuba's history, which impacted the formation of the Habanera.
La isla hermosa del ardiente sol, bajo tu cielo azul.
The Spanish colony of Cuba in the mid-18th century was primarily a forested and uncharted island. It was known as the famed city of Havana. The port city had been built in the 1560s, utilizing a natural harbor on the north of the island to act as a depository from where the Spanish treasure fleet could pick up a large naval escort and protection. During the mid-18th century, political control of Cuba still lay with the Captain General, who himself ultimately depended on the viceroy in Mexico, which was part of the larger viceroyalty of Nueva España, New Spain. Mexico was several weeks away by boat, and Spain over 6 weeks. Cuba was governed by a small bureaucracy of officials who had been appointed to their posts by the administrators in Sevilla, Spain. Many of these positions were poorly paid. From Spain came treasurers, accountants, judges, naval commissars, and port officials of every kind. They came as poor peninsulares in hopes to one day return rich to Andalusia or Castilla. Nevertheless, many such persons never in fact returned home and left their families to swell the class of criollos, white Spaniards, who managed the town councils, established prices for most basic commodities, farmed, and often eventually became merchants or landowners. The criollos formed an aristocracy in which a handful of Spanish families owned most of the island for many generations. They would live in Havana and visit their sugar plantations during harvest time. Cuba did have slaves, but 3 things distinguish Cuba from many non-Spanish colonies in the Caribbean: the relatively small number of slaves, the relatively large number of free blacks and mulattoes, the importance of urban life. The social and political structure of the island of Cuba, like that of the rest of the Spanish Empire, had led to the creation of cities. During the second half of the 18th century, Cuba was transformed into a prosperous sugar colony. More and more investors from outside of the Spanish Empire put money into Cuba to benefit both themselves and the island. A significant event that marked the island occurred in 1762, when the British temporarily occupied Havana under the victory by Lord Albemarle. Since 1492, Havana had never fallen to foreign invaders. The capturing of Havana created a mercantile and cultural boom. The British victory was also the opportunity for an immediate descent on the island by merchants of all sorts from the British Empire. The British influence also brought with them the popular English dance of the time, the country dance. This was the moment that introduced Cuba to the dance, which ultimately becomes the origin of the Habanera. Another consequence following the British occupation was the introduction of 4,000 new black slaves that were sold on the island. This figure was equivalent to 1/8 of the number of slaves on the island at the time. This massive influx of African cultures, traditions, and dances, which would be another component priming the birth of the Habanera. Havana continued with its financial successes since the British had freed the requirement of paying old Spanish taxes on the island. This also was a decree that no longer would there be Spanish regulations on any incoming traders. Eventually, the British left their interest in the island after the Paris Peace Accord of 1763, and it remained free to rule by the established criollo aristocracies. Ultimately, in 1776, Havana became a free port, eventually returned to the Spanish crown, and Spain reintroduced taxes, but at a fairer rate. This was their idea of economic achievement. From that point on, foreign merchants were not only permitted to enter and to settle on the island, but were allowed to buy property. So both British and United States merchants were soon to be found well established there. This provided for financial success for the island well into the next century, as tobacco and sugar continued to be the staple crops. Spanish hold on the island was weakened when Napoleon invaded Spain in 1808 and offered the Cubans the opportunity to start thinking about declaring themselves a self-governing colony. It was at this stage that they began to search for their Cuban identity. Spanish hold on the island would soon span 4 centuries, leading from 1492, with the discovery of the Americas by Columbus, all the way to 1898, when the Cuban Revolution broke ties with Spain. Ultimately, it was the fusion of the English country dance, danced by the black slave population on the island, which added these African elements and gestures, which spawned the formation of the Habanera, with its lilting rhythm, a variant on the more reserved and straightforward contradance. The contradanza is a fusion of European and African elements and has its roots in the English country dance, which gained popularity in Europe in the 18th century. Apart from being a social dance, the country dance was regarded as a moderate and healthful exercise, a pleasant and innocent diversion. If modestly used and performed at convenient times, it would be suitable for company. The country dance was danced in 2 longer parallel lines of dancers. In France, it was altered and had the dancers assume a more compact cube formation, with participants facing each other. The French, who adopted one particular form of the English country dance, knew it as the square dance for 8. They developed it and called it the contradance. The music that had accompanied both dance had a two-part melody divided into two sections that repeated. 8 bars in the first melody, then 8 more in the second. The meter was always duple, either 2/4 or 6/8, and was lively, especially in the second portion. Typically, the music was in major keys and would have been sung by the large part of society. The English country dance had made its way to France during the early 18th century and quickly became the most popular dance of the century, eclipsing even the minuet. An abundant amount of repertoire exists for the form, with composers such as Bird, Campra, Rameau, Mouret, Leclerc, Mozart, and even Beethoven writing contradance music. Gradually, both the country dance and the French contradance transitioned into becoming a new dance style in Cuba, known as the contradanza, extremely similar to both, but with a new Cuban flair and stamp. The contradanza was particularly popular in the salons of the Cuban upper classes. The dances were led by a bastonero who called out certain figures. The figures consisted of 4 sets of figures: the slow paseo en cadena, followed by the fast sostenido and cedazo. It was not long before Cubans began developing their own new dances, including the famous habanera, with its African syncopations and swaying rhythms. The habanera would be an offshoot of the contradanza, and it literally means dance from Havana. In its basic form, the early habanera consisted of 2 sections of 8 bars each, repeated for a total of 32 bars. Each 8-bar segment was distinguished by a different dance figure. The second half was livelier than the first. Black musicians of Cuba transformed the standard rhythms of the contradanza into dotted and syncopated rhythms. They also introduced traits of their traditional African dances. The habanera is typically in a slow tempo and in duple meter. It features a sensual and lilting rhythmic ostinato in the bass that became very popular in all levels of Cuban society. The dance, performed by couples, featured a luxurious step pattern in which the feet hardly lifted from the ground. This was accompanied by sensual movements of the arms, hips, head, and even the eyes. Its influence can be seen in the evolution of the Cuban danzón and even the Argentine tango. In Spain, it was also immersed into the zarzuela. The first publication of an habanera composition is of the anonymous selection El Amor en el Baile, The Love in the Dance, which you are hearing now. It was published in the Havana newspaper La Prensa in 1842. The publication referred to it as the new habanera song. More recurrent Cuban descriptions of the new style label them as the contradanza habanera or danza habanera. In Cuba, the popular dance was transcribed into piano music by Manuel Samuel Robredo. He lived from 1817 to 1870. and Ignacio Cervantes, 1847 to 1905. These composers were responsible for taking the first decisive steps towards musical nationalism in Cuba. The habanera was used to propel this movement, being that it was most recognizable and typically Cuban in form. Robredo incorporated music elements from Afro-Cuban genres and Guajira traditions, coupled with a romantic piano style. The harmonies are often evocative of Chopin to serve to set the groundwork for 19th century Cuban art music contributions. Cervantes was best known for short piano works of the Cuban contradanza, Habanera type. He wrote more than 50 beautiful examples in which rhythmic and melodic ideas capitalized on the habanera. In 2/4 or in 6/8, these works reveal an extraordinary variety of rhythmic combinations. Their second sections generally present the most national character by means of rhythmic figuration. Cervantes had a successful career as a concert pianist in Cuba, Europe, and even in the United States. He is very popular for his 21 danzas cubanas, 21 dances. Many of the selections are contradanzas, which embody the new nationalistic Cuban trend. In description of these early piano works, Cervantes maintains the two-part form, with 16 measure sections of the contradanza, and follows the rhythmic patterns associated with the tango and the habanera. Cervantes goes on to provide a step forward by featuring a foreshadowing of the new awareness of the new Cuban folk and popular genres of the early 20th century, specifically in reference to Afro-Cubanism. Afro-Cubanism. This period marks the transition from the heavy Spanish or Cuban culture to the new independent Cuban identification. From the late 19th to the early 20th centuries, Cubans increasingly sought modes of artistic expression which would be sufficiently distant from those of Spain. The habanera, which was considered sophisticated salon music, was slowly replaced by the bolero, which is derived from the son. This rhythm served as a slow and lilting dance, replacing, at the beginning of the 20th century, the danceable form of the habanera. The practice of adding text to the new piano arrangements by Robredo and Cervantes with lyric content began in the first half of the 19th century. One of the first attempts to achieve this process is with the habanera titled La Paloma, the Pigeon, by Sebastián Iradier. The addition of text and sensual lyric became an immediate success in the song. From that point on, several other Habanera song arrangements were composed. These early vocal arrangements featured a melodic line that was more akin to the treatment of a romanza and opera arias. The melodic line gained presence, at which was more extensive and fluid due to the use of the poetic texts, with long verses and literary images, which inspired the ample capabilities of the solo singer. Let us recall the impetus of the Habanera, which was due in part to the rich culture of ida y vuelta, there and back, that existed between Cuba and Spain. This was primarily through sea trade and naval conquests. For this reason, of course, the texts are mostly Spanish. Habaneras sing of romantic relationships, mostly with the sensual mulata, which is a Cuban woman of mixed African and Spanish blood. They sing of sad farewells, of loneliness at sea, and they even support themes with the belief that many of the men had families both in Spain and in Cuba. In 1890, Eduardo Sanchez Fuentes, living from 1874 to 1944, composes Tú, meaning you, at the young age of 16. The text by Fernán Sánchez reads, "In Cuba, the beautiful island of warming sun, under its blue skies, lovely tan women of all the flowers, the queen is you. In Cuba, the island of the warm sun, when its blue skies, lovely tan woman of all the flowers, the queen is you. Sacred fire guards your heart. The clear skies, its joy is in you, and your stars has confused the gods. From your eyes, the night and the light and the rays of the sun. Sweet is the sugar cane, but your voice is even more so. Bitterness is overtaken by your heart. When thinking of you, my lute sighs. Blessings are all in you, because Cuba is you."
En Cuba, la isla hermosa del ardiente sol, bajo su cielo azul, adorable trigueña de todas las flores, la reina eres tú. La palma que en el bosque se mece gentil, tu sueño arrulló, y en un beso de la brisa al morir de la tarde te despertó. Fuego sagrado, guarda tu corazón, el claro cielo su alegría me dio, y en tus miradas a confundir.
The song becomes hugely popular and becomes one of the most idealized and representative songs of the new genre. The genre which fuses melody, lyric, and music to the Habanera form. Tú takes the decisive step in pitting a sensual vocal melody with a text that then sets the Habanera as a genre typical in exhalation of women, of nature, and of the Cuban landscape. Although he even later toured Italy to produce his own opera titled You Morí, Sánchez Fuentes will remain above all a composer of habaneras and songs. In 100 years, his Cuban melodies will occupy a place of honor in our traditions. That is how he was quoted by a popular music historian from Cuba. The popularity of Tu carries it into the 20th century, into multiple European countries, and even South American countries. The song gains particular favor in Argentina. There, it slowly transitions into becoming the Argentine tango. Note the similarity of the Habanera rhythm to what we know in the tango. In the back and forth voyages, it was inevitable that the music would find its way into the hands of European composers, mainly French and Spanish, that were interested in incorporating new exotic genres in their music. Some well-known examples of the form are La Paloma by Sebastián Irardier and Tu. But we also know that Bizet, or may know that Bizet, borrowed, or some say stole, Irardier's El Arreglito from the 1840s for the famous habanera in the aria from Carmen. Habanera rhythms found their way into French instrumental pieces as well. Works by Sasson, Chabrier, works by Debussy, Tu returns to Spain and scores a fisherman at the coast of the Costa Brava in the Mediterranean of southern Spain. Hear this song and songs similar, and learn them and sing them as they mend their nets. Fishermen heard these songs come from their friends that had been in voyages in Cuba and in Latin America. They learned these habanera songs and transmitted them to other fishermen orally. This repertoire was sung by the fishermen, and eventually they even formed choirs and sang in unison, and later on, even explored polyphony, of course, all unnotated, all sung as they repaired their fishing nets. The fishermen sang in taverns, they sang on the shores, and the fishermen are instrumental for maintaining this art form.
Cuando en la playa la bella Lola, su larga cola luciendo va. Los marineros se vuelven locos y hasta el piloto pierde el compás. ¡Ay, qué placer sentía yo cuando en la playa sacó el pañuelo y me saludó! Luego después se acercó a mí, me dio un abrazo y en aquel lazo creí morir. La cubanita lloraba triste al verse sola y en alta mar, y el marinero la consolaba: no llores, Lola, no te has de ahogar. ¡Ay, qué placer sentía yo cuando en la playa sacó el pañuelo y me saludó! Luego después se acercó a mí, me dio un abrazo y en aquel lazo creí morir.
The polyphonic choral habanera was formed slowly as a result of arranging the traditional habanera melodies and the rhythms into a full 4-part, unaccompanied choral texture. There is a sizable body of repertoire available today of this genre, which continues to be unknown to non-Iberian choral circles. The choral form has continued to delight audiences and ensembles throughout the 20th century, and offers a repertoire that features an ensemble singing genre of very high quality. The polyphonic choral habanera has received a boost from tourism and also several choral ensembles in search of new music. There are regular summer festivals along the Spanish Mediterranean coast today, festivals that have started in the mid-20th century, which feature polyphonic choral habanera contests. One of the most notable is in Torrevieja, Spain. This is a small coastal city in which, in the summer months, mostly Spanish locals and tourists flood its coasts to catch the annual choral contest in Torrevieja, known as the Certamen Internacional de Habaneras y Polifonía, the international choral contest of Habaneras and polyphony. Every July, music aficionados and highly prepared choirs come to celebrate the polyphonic choral habanera here.
¿Qué tal? Buenas noches. Bienvenidos a la sexta velada de la edición número 65 del Certamen Internacional de Habaneras y Polifonía de Torrevieja. La última velada de concurso.
Rosita de un verde palmar cantaba feliz. Dejó de cantar, dejó de reír. Moveduna, 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 clavija en las cuerdas. Moveduna, 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 clavija en las cuerdas. Que tañes, que tañes, que tañes, que moveduna. Moveduna, 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 clavija. Que tañes en las cuerdas la clavija, pues el sol se esconde al reloj en media luna. Moveduna. La la, la la, la la, la la, Rosita del verde palmar, la la.
In this next and final clip, I'd like to present the Philippine madrigal singers performing the Habanera Tu by Sanchez Fuentes. The madrigal ensemble is lauded for their precision-making in music and for their musicality. They have won the festival several times over. The arrangement is by Manuel Lisotilitel. It was first presented at the very first Habanera contest in 1954 as a required work, and has been featured ever since. Thank you for taking this journey with me in this presentation and discussing the roots of the Habanera style, the rhythm, and the music, by first discussing Cuban colonial history, then tracing the connections between Spain and Cuba, which brought the form to Europe. We discussed the influences of the Habanera on the broader European styles, and understood the manifestation on 20th century genres, and most importantly, the development of the polyphonic choral Habanera. I hope that my efforts will ultimately allow me to serve as a bridge between Spain and the rest of the world, in outlining the origin and evolution of the polyphonic choral Habanera, in order to unlock a valuable body of relatively unknown choral repertoire for ensembles and audiences outside of Spain.